figure inspiring protesters in central Kiev by playing piano on and around the barricades of Independence Square. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report, as we continue our discussion about the vote in Crimea, the overwhelming referendum vote for secession from Ukraine to join Russia. We're joined in Moscow by Dmitry Trenin, director of the Carnegie Moscow Center. And now we're turning to, as well, Nicholas Clayton, who is a freelance journalist just back from Crimea and Ukraine. He has covered the South Caucasus since 2009, contributed a recent piece in USA Today called Military Tension High as Crimea Holds Referendum. Nicholas, you're now speaking to us from Istanbul, but talk about the new leadership in Ukraine and what their response has been.
Well, the new leadership, it appears that they're still very much in crisis mode, attempting to hold the country together. Many of them were not in the government before the Yanukovych regime fell. One of the more controversial things that has happened recently, and one of the firmer gestures that the new government has made, is saying that those advocating secession in other Ukrainian territories will be apprehended. And on one hand, this is a bit of an escalation of the rhetoric within Ukraine. However, it also represents very much the crisis mentality of the new government. As you mentioned before, there have been increasing protests in the cities of Kharkiv, Donetsk, and Lugansk, where pro-Russia and pro-Ukraine protesters have clashed, and 3 people have died so far. There's been accusations traded, but Kiev has claimed that a large portion, if not the majority, of these pro-Russian protesters are indeed Russian citizens that have been bussed in from Russia, and they're also tightening the border. It appears that they're trying very hard to avoid any other province in Ukraine from getting the Crimea treatment at this point.
On Sunday, a prominent Russian state TV host whose close ties to Vladimir Putin warned Russia could launch a nuclear strike against the United States. The anchor, Dmitry Kiselyov, spoke with a picture of a nuclear explosion behind him and words, "into radioactive ashes."
Russia
is the only country in the world that is really able to turn the United States into radioactive ashes. I don't know if it's a coincidence, but Obama called Putin on January 21st and probably again tried to put pressure on him. But on the very next day, on January 22nd, the official newspaper of the government of Russia published an article where it very clearly explained in detail how our system of guaranteed nuclear revenge works. It is called Perimeter. In the USA, it was nicknamed Dead Hand. Actually, I advise you read the article.
That's Russian state TV host who has close ties to Vladimir Putin speaking on Sunday. His name is Dmitry Kiselyov. Nicholas Clayton, your response?
Well, I mean, this obviously shows how heated the rhetoric has become. And I think, honestly, this has to be looked at from 2 different ways. The whole situation is very much a crisis within Ukraine politics, and also obviously the clash between the East and the West. As we've discussed already this hour, I do think that many in the West underestimated how strategic Ukraine, and particularly Crimea, is to Russia. The port of Sevastopol has been the base of the Russian Black Sea Fleet since imperial days, since the 18th century, and it actually is probably the best harbor in the Black Sea for a large fleet, and one of the only ones that could safely hold a large fleet. It has a deep harbor, it's very large, and it's protected on both sides by hills, which means the wind is not a factor. If Russia were to be booted from there, it would have to drastically reduce the size of its fleet. And spend billions of dollars attempting to build up facilities in one of its other ports in order to hold it. And the Russian Black Sea Fleet is the portion of the Russian Navy that it uses to project naval force into not only the Black Sea, where it has significant interests, but also the Mediterranean Sea and through the Sinai and the Indian Ocean. And therefore, it's an important portion of their Middle East strategy and their foreign policy in those regions. And so this really is a what the Russians call a steel interest, something that is certainly a red line, and certainly something that if Russia had to retreat from, would be very much hurt their foreign policy and their ability to project power in the world. And we saw, it was partially why Russia moved so quickly, perhaps, was that many figures in the new government in Kiev did make statements saying that they wanted to basically cancel the lease that Russia has for the use of the base in Sevastopol. The current lease gives Russia the right to use that port until 2042, but there, in the past, previous governments have also tried to push Russia out, and it has been a major factor in Russia's relationship with Ukraine since the end of the Soviet Union, and very much been a huge card in the East-West battle over Ukraine as well. I mean,
we saw what happened when the U.S. military was concerned that U.S. interests were being threatened in the Panama Canal when they controlled it. The U.S. invaded Panama.
Yeah, it's an interestingly analogous situation, and you add to this the fact that I mean, while Russia's accusations of threats towards Russian citizens in Crimea and other places in eastern Ukraine are definitely hyperbolic, and there's little to no evidence that Russian speakers were really threatened physically by the change of government in Ukraine. There nonetheless were serious fears and a lot of apprehension among Russian speakers in those portions of the country, absent some of this media blitz that Russia has been piping out. I mean, to use a crude analogy for the United States, it would be as if the Occupy movement, and regardless of what you think of the Occupy movement or its politics, but if it had continued and grown in intensity to the point where it led to violence that left over 100 people dead, including a couple dozen police officers, and took power in the United States, filling up a government with protest leaders and a mix of the more liberal wing of the Democratic Party, right or wrong, that would automatically, force a very strong reaction and a lot of paranoia in the conservative portions of the country. And the way that the Ukraine has been politically divided over this time, and we're seeing a similar reaction, that the Ukraine has been internally politically divided between East and West, and even a lot of Russians that didn't necessarily didn't have specific fears about their rights. Nonetheless, the fact that there was an overthrow of the government just a month ago, and all of the uncertainty that came from that, many did, in Crimea, were saying that they were looking for some sort of sign of protection or stability, and in Crimea, that came in the form of Russia. And that's why it's really important for the Western powers as they've come in to understand that right or wrong, there are many in both Ukraine and in Russia, obviously, that do not recognize the new Ukrainian government in Kiev as legitimate. And so while it's important to support that government in the short term to make sure that Ukraine remains stable, I think it's also important for Western leaders to understand that the Maidan movement in Kiev did not necessarily represent every Ukrainian, just like the Occupy movement was not necessarily supported by constituencies in Kansas and Utah. And that there needs to be a solution and a push for a solution that incorporates the interests of both sides and that can reduce the overall internal tensions within Ukraine.
Dmitry Trenin, the comparison of the U.S. and the West immediately recognizing Kosovo as an independent nation compared to the response to the referendum in Crimea. How is that seen in Moscow?
Well, I think it's ironic. It's interesting that the West and Russia have traded places. I would say cynics would say that this is normal because their interests demand that they do so. The Kosovo independence was not achieved with the consent of the Serbian government. It did not have a referendum, and yet it was recognized by most of European countries and by the United States. The Russians did not recognize it, but now the Russians are using the Kosovo precedent to justify their position on Crimea. And although it is clear that the government in Kiev, the revolutionary government in Kiev, I should say, does not have an impeccable legal mandate, to put it mildly, it is clear that again, whatever you think of the referendum, the Russian role in it, the legality of it, the short order holding of that referendum, it is clear that the vast majority of the people in Crimea welcomed the chance to be reunited with Russia, and there the West does not recognize the referendum. So you have the West and Russia changing places depending on essentially their interests. This is a good illustration of double standards, I would say, on both sides.
Very quickly to both of you as we wrap up, what do you think could diminish the tensions now? The U.S. is pushing for increased sanctions against Russia. Let's start with Dmitry Trenin in Moscow.
Well, I think that we will have to go through a period of heightened tensions. The question is how long this period will be, how deep the sanctions will bite, what kind of response will Russia give. I think that we're standing at the beginning of some pretty turbulent period in international relations.
Nicholas Clayton.
Well, it's difficult to see what each side would be looking to get out of it at this stage. The unfortunate part is that trust has very much been undermined by several episodes within this whole crisis. And at this point, Russia likely looks at the situation like it's gotten what it wants. And from the Western standpoint, that they seem to be putting most of their backing behind the government in Kiev. Therefore, they don't want to make concessions on that account either. So while a federalist option and some sort of mutual compromise involving autonomy for certain regions would be certainly beneficial to the country potentially, it's difficult to see if both sides have the willingness to really come together on that.
We're going to leave it there. Nicholas Clayton, freelance journalist, recently reported from Crimea, now in Istanbul. Most recently wrote a piece in USA Today. And I want to thank Dmitry Trenin for joining us, director of the Carnegie Moscow Center. Among his pieces, The Crisis in Crimea Could Lead the World into a Second Cold War. And before that, Oliver Bullough speaking to us from Crimea. He was Reuters Moscow correspondent, now the Caucasus editor of Institute for War and Peace Reporting. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back.